Just getting started. It's so wonderful to see such a great turnout for this, our symposium on invisible work in the digital humanities. So it's been a lot of fun putting this together, and I'm excited to see so many people here. I know many of you come from long distance, so this is just really great. My name is Paul Marty. I'm a professor in the School of Information here at FSU, and I'm one of the organizers for the conference, and I'm just delighted to welcome you all here today. I wanted to point out that we are going to be doing conference back channel tweeting at IWDHFSU, so if you're tweeting, that's the hashtag to use. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning before our first keynote talking to you about the topic and why we chose it and all the various things that are going to happen over the next day and a half. And I'm going to kick things off by thanking a whole bunch of people, so you can all applause wildly as we go through this list. First off, the four organizers who worked tirelessly on this since we kicked things off in January. It's hard to believe that we put this all together in such a short amount of time, but yes, starting in January of this year, we said we were going to do this, and we pulled this together. So Therese Sammer-Graven from the Department of English, I'm from the School of Information, Ellen Romano from the Program in Interdisciplinary Humanities, and Micah Vandergrift from the University Library. So thank you everybody for all of my work there. I also wanted to give a special shout out to all of these sponsors who have very kindly donated money to make this happen. The University Libraries, the Office of the Provost, the Department of English, the School of Information, the Program in Interdisciplinary Humanities, the Office of Research, and the Office of Digital Research and Scholarship. So thank you very much for that. We could not have pulled this off without the support of all of these people. And then, of course, we have our wonderful three keynote speakers, Mark Algee-Hewitt from Stanford, Cheryl Ball from West Virginia, and Roxanne Shirazi from CUNY. And so thank them very much. We will have detailed introductions for all of our speakers before their keynote talks. I also wanted to thank the people who have volunteered to be our small group moderators and note takers. During our breakout group sessions, we're going to have a moderator in each group and people taking notes. So appreciate very much to our moderators in particular for volunteering their time to make sure that those are going to go smoothly, and the note takers will make sure that everything that is said is taken down and recorded for posterity. So thank you very much to them. And I also wanted to give a special thanks to many people working behind the scenes to make this happen. I know I do not have everybody's name on these slides. We did our best to get as many names as possible, but I think this speaks words or millions of words about the whole problem of invisible work in the digital humanities, that just getting a list of everybody who worked behind the scenes, I can see people in the room right now whose names are not on these slides. Also, there's the difficulty that for some of the people we didn't even know their last names. So talk about invisible work, but we did our best to thank everybody and the many people who worked on this project. So thank you again to all of those people there. Again, none of this could have been pulled off without the work of so many different people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the current state of digital humanities and digital scholarship at FSU. I can remember, I've been here 15 years, and I can remember 10 years ago wandering around this campus and saying, have you heard about the digital humanities program on campus? And people would say to me, no. And I would say, me either. And we worked really hard. Many different people have been trying to push these initiatives forward, lots of different projects, lots of different groups, lots of different organizations. And it's been very interesting in particular to see the interplay between digital humanities projects writ large, digital scholarly as its own unique force, and how that connects to so many different research initiatives on campus. And I wanted to showcase just a couple of quick projects and initiatives to show you the scope of the things that are happening here at FSU. I know there are many people here who are not from FSU, and I also know that many of the people within the university are not aware of the things that are going on. So just very quickly to show off a couple of things. Three sample projects. A wonderful project here on Linked Women and Pedagogues, which traces all kinds of interesting influence about women over the years, and takes a very interesting look at the metadata around this project. I highly recommend taking a look at this, and this is a project collaboration between Therese Graven and Richard Irvin, Stephen McElroy, and Sarah Stanley. So all kinds of interesting work going on here. Oh, and let me point out, these slides are going to be posted to the main website. They're not there right now because I was just putting the whole slide deck together as you were all eating breakfast, but they will go up very shortly. So you don't have to worry about writing all of these URLs down right now. They will be posted online. Fantastic project digitizing the Italian newspaper Il Secolo. This is a project run by Silvia Belisa from Modern Languages. really fantastic things, and a great collaboration with digital scholarship here on campus. And I also wanted to highlight this fantastic Burroughs Archive project, which, if you're a fan of Blade Runner, I highly recommend you take a look at this. And this is a fascinating collaboration between FSU and the University of Antwerp, and it's headed by Stan Gantarski here at FSU and Special Collections and the Office of Digital Research and Scholarship. Speaking of which, I wanted to highlight that office. We have a fantastic office here in the University Libraries, headed by Micah Vandergrift, which is our Office of Digital Research and Scholarship, also in the office of Sarah Stanley and Devin Soper, who do a fantastic job of providing support to everyone across campus interested in digital research and digital scholarly projects. I talked to many faculty across this campus who take advantage of these resources and work with the staff here in this office, and it's a tremendous collaborative partnership. And the existence of this office is one of the driving forces behind this symposium and why we wanted to get together and talk about these issues. Another factor that had a strong influence on all of this is the development of our new Digital Humanities graduate program, headed by Alan Romano in the program for Interdisciplinary Humanities. So we have a new master's degree in digital humanities, which is taking off very nicely, and there's a lot of interesting work being done there, and some great students who have joined that program. And also, we have an excellent interdisciplinary group of students and scholars who are interested in digital research and digital scholarship that meets regularly across the university. This group is headed by Therese and also with Micah, coordinating these discussions and these readings. And it's a really great group just to discuss a lot of these issues and see what's going on across campus. And it was through these conversations that the idea for this symposium came out. So, why a symposium on this topic? Why talk about invisible work? Why talk about invisible work in the digital humanities? Well, one of the areas in which I work as a professor of information science is I look at museum informatics. I look at information professionals in museums and the information systems that they build in museums. And one of the concerns that I hear repeated over and over again is that the work that they do is invisible. No one has any idea what they're up to. The museum curators don't know, the museum directors don't know, and I travel the country and I visit museums, and the lament that I hear over and over again is, we're struggling along, hobbling forward on a strung together digital system that was built in the mid-1990s, and we don't have the money to replace it, we don't have the ability to update it, and not a single person understands the extent of this problem, right? Or how close we are to just collapsing and falling apart and losing hundreds of thousands of records and the whole museum essentially collapsing. And how do you make those efforts more visible? How do you help people understand what's going on behind the scenes? And even when I find a sympathetic museum director who says, well, I would love to fund our information department. I would love to fund our information workers, but my resources are limited. I really have to hire another curator to put together another exhibit to bring in the donors so we can get a new wing on the museum. And so trying to figure out what the digital work is and how to make that work more visible is a very difficult problem. And in these discussion groups that we've been having, one of the things that I kept raising and that kept coming up in a lot of the conversations is, what are the underlying unspoken assumptions and invisible works going on in digital scholarly projects on this campus and in other universities? How do we know who's really working on these projects and what they're doing? What are the unspoken assumptions that maybe if we made them more clear, we'd have a better understanding of where the project is going and what things they're trying to do? Many of these unspoken assumptions, much of this invisible work, has the potential to derail a collaborative project. And if we don't make those assumptions visible, if we don't make that invisible work visible, you could see a project at a very late stage in the project's life suddenly fall apart because so much of this work is unknown. And this is especially a problem when the collaborators might have different understandings about the nature of the work, the goal of the work. So how do we get everybody on the same page? How do we make all the work that's going on as visible as we can? How do we make sure that everybody understands what everybody else is doing? And as we talked about this in our groups, we identified three themes, which are the three themes of this particular conference. This first theme And the three keynotes are roughly paralleling these themes. Our breakout groups are roughly paralleling these themes. So it's all sort of going to connect together is the plan. Diverging expectations. Does everybody working on this same project share the same goals? It's a tough question when you start thinking about it. Lots of these digital scholarly projects start with a whole bunch of different people coming together, and they all believe they're working towards the same end. But as they work on the project, sometimes hidden goals, hidden agendas, and I don't mean this in any kind of negative way, right? But people may have different perceptions about where the projects are going. And as the project goes along, those expectations have a tendency to diverge. And what happens at that point? Do people even know when we reach that point in the project? How do the projects keep going past that point? Sometimes projects will end before people have even realized that this divergence has happened, and people will look back at the project and say, is that really what we expected? One of the examples I always like to use is look at a lot of the early digitization work that IBM did in the 1990s. Right? And if you remember when IBM went and digitized the Vatican archives, right? IBM also went and worked with other museums in Egypt. They worked with the Hermitage. They did a lot. They had a really nice cultural heritage division. And I knew some of the folks who worked at that division. And one of the interesting things that came out of a lot of those projects is that it wasn't always clear to the museums that they were working with, the archives that they were working with, that IBM was testing technologies. Right? IBM's not just coming into this museum out of the kindness of their heart to digitize the collection. IBM has technology they wanted to see if it works, how well it worked. And yes, that works together to make a shared goal, sure, right? But at some point, IBM's need to make sure their systems work doesn't necessarily line up with the Vatican's need to make the archives online or whatever they might have. And when you reach that point, what happens? And sometimes people will look back at these projects and say, wow, that really didn't end up where I thought it was going to end up. The second theme, unequal labor, is something that I think has been talked about a lot in this field, but is still not talked about enough. It's very hard to understand the inequalities of the labor work that goes on behind the scenes. Just the slides I was showing earlier where we didn't have last names for the students, right? This is how do we make sure that everybody working on a project is sufficiently credited? Right? We have people back here doing a live stream of this. This wasn't set up until just this morning, so they're not on the slides, right? But it's important that we identify all of these relationships, that we call out the nature of these relationships and pay attention to the labor inequalities. And finally, the overall theme of invisible work. How do we know who's doing what? How do we make this work more visible? One of the concerns that I see, especially when I talk to people in museums, is that as long as the work is invisible, their work is frequently taken for granted. And even worse, as museums, libraries, archives, and other organizations make their resources available online, many of them do it for free. And one of the side effects of making information available free is a lot of people seem to believe if it's free for me to access, it must be free for you to create. So it's very hard for people to understand how much work is going on behind the scenes. Because as a profession, we have worked extremely hard to make sure people don't see the invisible work. Right? We've made this work invisible on purpose. We're trying to make it easy for everyone to access our resources. But the difficulty is, as we succeed in doing that, we've hidden so much of the labor that's happening behind the scenes. And what are the long-term implications of that going to be for libraries, archives, museums, research in general? So what we're hoping to get out of this symposium is a good detailed think, really, about all of these issues. I want to stress that this is a working symposium. This is not just you all sitting here listening to people talking. Right? This is us all getting together and talking about these really key, important issues. We have breakout groups, we have lots of group discussion opportunities, and we have some very clear goals that we want to have come out of the next day and a half. First, we are really hoping that all of these conversations are going to result in a very nice white paper about these topics that everyone here will have contributed to. And we mean that. We really want it to be clear that when you take a look at the white paper, which we hope to have up early in the spring semester based on this conversation, you'll say, I was part of this, I was part of this conversation, I see how my contributions ended up here. And then based on that white paper, we're going to put out a call for papers for a special issue of Digital Humanities Quarterly. This is already on the books for, Therese, what do we have this for? 2018. So it's going to be a great opportunity to get some good scholarly articles about this work as well. So we're really trying to push this together, that we can all work together to identify the important issues and the problems and really to articulate these themes. One way of putting it, I think, is that we, the organizers and the folks who have been talking about this here on campus, have taken this as far as we can. And we're ready to present all these ideas, listen to the keynote speakers, find out what's going on, hear from all of you, and push this all together into an agenda to move things forward. There are also some really great opportunities, I think, for collaborative research grant proposals to come out of this as well. So we're hoping to see a lot of those ideas come out too. So I wanted to briefly go over the agenda for the next day and a half. So we are here on Thursday, November 17, 8:30. That's this opening session. That's me talking right now. And then we're going to have our first keynote at 9, Mark Algee-Hewitt. And after the keynote and questions, we will have a short break. You can get coffee. And then we're going to go to our first breakout groups on the topic. You should all have a little sticker on your name tag. You do, right? What you do. That indicates what breakout group you are going to, and after the keynote, I will put up a slide showing which room is associated with which stickers, so you'll know where to go. We'll spend an hour in our breakout groups, and then we will come back here and spend an hour-ish talking about what happened in the breakout groups, trying to identify the themes and the concepts that came out of things before we have lunch. And lunch will be in this room, right? Lunch will be in this room. So we're going to leave this room, we're going to come back to this room, and we'll have the group discussion while everyone smells lunch being set up. And then, and then we'll eat lunch. And then in the afternoon, we will have our second keynote. I am sad to say that Dr. Ball had a personal situation arise and was unable to travel to be with us in person here today. But she has kindly agreed to join us remotely. So she will be Skyping in to give her keynote at 1 o'clock today. And I believe joining us also for the group discussion about the topic as well, remotely. So we will have her keynote at 1 o'clock. Then again, we will have a short break, and then we will go to our breakout groups, the same rooms. So you've all been randomly assigned to rooms, so I hope you like the people you've been randomly assigned with, because you're going to see them a lot over the next day and a half. So the same breakout groups, the same breakout rooms where we talk about the second topic, unequal labels. Then we're going to come back here and have a group discussion about everything that happened in the group breakout rooms. Then we have an hour break, and then we're going to reconvene for a dinner reception at the Heritage Museum in Dodd Hall. And there are maps on the website as to how to get there from here. It's not a very far walk from the library. It's just down Landis Green to your left. It's a beautiful facility for those of you that have not seen it. You're really going to enjoy visiting that. And also the weather should be absolutely gorgeous. So if you're from out of town, that's a wonderful hour just to walk around and get a sense of what the campus is like. Should be very pretty. Then we're meeting back here Friday morning, shifting just a little half hour later on Friday morning, so coffee and refreshments at 8:30 in the morning, just like we have here, and then our first keynote at 9 o'clock, where Roxanne will present to us on the topic of invisible work, and we will repeat the same thing, a short break, go to your same breakout groups, and we come back and we talk about this topic, and then we have lunch again in this room. And then after lunch, we will have a 1-hour closing session as we discuss how we're putting this all together into the white paper and where we're moving forward and what ideas people have about how we're going to do our next steps, and make sure we all have very clear action items. Unlike many faculty, I really believe in action items. I know many faculty have perfected the ability to go to meetings and walk out never having come to an action item, but hopefully we will have some good action items here for moving forward, and we will wrap it up by 2 o'clock p.m. on Friday. So hopefully that all makes sense. Are there any questions on the agenda? Everybody clear? The schedule is also on the website as well, so it's all there. It should be pretty straightforward. All the breakout rooms are here in the library, so you're not going to have to leave the building to go to those. So right now, what I would love to do is introduce the Dean of the University Libraries, Julia Zimmerman. Julia, if you would like to come up and welcome us all here, this would be fantastic. Julia has been a huge supporter of this symposium, and we are just really thrilled to be here in the library for this event.
Well, I'm happy to be here too, and I want to I want to welcome everybody to FSU and to Strozier Library and to the Robert B. Bradley Room. And I'm going to say a word about Robert B. Bradley for those who might have wondered who the room is named for. He talk about invisible work. He was in state government for many, many years. He was the CFO of the state under one of our very best governors some years back, and after that entered the field of higher education and has been a true public servant, not just for the state, but for Florida State as well. Supported the libraries through the entire time he has been here, and you just couldn't ask for a better friend, a smarter person, or anyone with a better sense of humor if you just want to talk about it. He's a great guy, and we're thrilled to have a room in the library named for him. While I'm talking about administration, I want to give a shout out to the FSU's administration, in particular our Provost Sally McCrory. Sally has been a huge supporter of digital humanities, our ability to develop a program here in the library and across campus. I think it's rare for a university administrator, particularly a provost with so many responsibilities, to have the vision to see this as something that is going to make a difference for the institution and for academia and research as a whole. So we really appreciate what Sally's done in supporting not just this event, but our entire effort across campus to ramp things up. I want to echo Paul's thanks to everyone who is participating in this thing today. Those of you who are speakers, really appreciate your being here. Those of you who are attendees and who are going to give your ideas and thoughts to whatever comes out of the day, of the 2 days, excuse me. I want to thank the staff who helped put this together, and Paul's right, it takes so much work to do something like this. So I would like everybody who worked on the symposium to stand up, and let's just give them a hand. Thank you all, that's terrific. That said, I hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope many good things come out of this work that you're going to do together. I look forward to seeing you throughout the next day and a half, and particularly look forward to seeing the work that emerges both individually and collectively from your being here today. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. So now I'm going to invite Dr. Alan Love, who is the director of our Digital Humanities program here on campus, and welcome to introduce our speaker.
Hi, so I get to be your host for the next few hours, mainly the one who gets to tell you when to go get food. So, right now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mark Algee-Hewitt. Mark Algee-Hewitt is assistant professor in the Department of English at Stanford University. He is also a co-director of the Stanford Literary Lab. He is a specialist in the study of the 18th and early 19th centuries in England and Germany, in the history of aesthetic theory, and the thought and literature of the Enlightenment and Romantic periods. Both in his own work and in his work as co-director of the Literary Lab, Mark Algee-Hewitt is a leading figure in digital and quantitative analyses of literary texts. His work really brings together the best of literary criticism and digital methods. His activities are both copious and wide-ranging, and he has a hand in a range of projects from work on the novel and poetry to book history.
You don't see me.
There we go. So what happens when, yeah, so someone else's slide deck.
I was invisible.
Yes, invisible hand. From work to book history, work on environmental legislation, curriculum development in DH, and many others. And here, one of the great things about DH work is that things are online. Stick their stuff there. So I encourage you to use the Google and find his pages up there, well-documented, wonderful projects. You'll also feel some sympathetic exhaustion, I think, at the number of labors going on there, but it's really fascinating and fantastic. His honors and accolades you can also find there, including most recently an Annenberg Faculty Fellowship at Stanford and numerous DH grants supporting that copious digital labor. Above all, and in light of our topic today, it is difficult not to be struck by the number of people, groups, collaborators, the network, let's say, that runs through many of these projects and is so clearly an integral part of his work. So I'm very pleased that he is here to kick off our conference today as the first of our 3 keynotes. His talk is The Invisible Lab, Collaborative Individualism, and the Paradox of the Digital Humanities. Please welcome Mark Algee-Hewitt.
Is it all just...
Just press the next button.
Hey.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, which, as is the nature of introductions, I now have to figure out how to live up to. And thank you all so much, both for inviting me here and for making the time yourselves early on a Thursday morning to come and discuss this, which I think is a topic, invisible labor as a whole, and as far as my talk goes, or my conversation goes, diverging expectations, a set of topics that themselves tend to be, as Paul very accurately said, rendered invisible by the kind of work that is valued as output of the digital humanities. And I want to start off by saying that this is actually an odd experience for me. As you'll see as I talk, most of what I do tends to focus on the results of various kinds of projects that we do at the lab. Projects that have quantitative, literary, interpretive, historical, or other kinds of what we might call material academic results. And so when I give talks, I'm used to presenting those results. So I actually very much welcome the chance to reflect for a little bit on what it takes to produce results like that, to reflect a bit on how we do, and by we I mean both the lab that I represent and that I work in, but we as a community of digital humanists, how we do the work that we do that enables us to produce the work that we can produce. And I've titled this The Invisible Lab, Collaborative Individualism and the Paradox of the Digital Humanities, and it's really that paradox that I want to speak most about. I will touch on a number of different kinds of invisible work, as Paul laid out so well in his introduction to this conference. People who are typically effaced from the process of digital humanities or of research or of scholarship, the unacknowledged labor, the years of work, corpus management, analyses, iterating analyses, writing, editing, that go into the production of a single project that may not look like much when it comes out, but represents years and years of work. But more than anything else, really what I want to talk about is the social labor of the digital humanities. That is, there is an onus on digital humanistic practices more so than most other disciplines or most other fields, given its very transdisciplinary and at turn interdisciplinary nature, that requires certain kinds of social configurations and social labor that so often goes unacknowledged in the presentation of projects, in the presentation of results. And in the course of this, I'll be touching on a number of various themes, including what it means to have a result in the digital humanities, what it means to have an outcome of a project, and how that can look very, very different to different groups of people who are working together in a supposedly and ideally collaborative environment. Divergent results, divergent practices, divergent expectations, both what goes into the project, that is, what are different people's goals based on their position within the academic university, within the universe of academia that they find themselves, and also based on disciplinary and field-specific understandings of what it means to create knowledge or do research. But before I launch into it, I also want to say that I do run a lab, a digital humanities lab, but a lab nonetheless. And so when I talk about being collaborative, I mean that in every possible sense. And so not only I'm going to ask you to do a couple things today, I also, although I know we've talked about setting aside a brief period of questions at the end, which I'd be thrilled to do, pro forma for the presentation. But at any point, if you have questions, if you want any clarification, if I say something that doesn't make sense, or or that you immediately want to respond to, I very much welcome you to interject, to ask very much at the moment. It's been a while since I've gotten all the way through a talk or a presentation of any kind without being interrupted at least a number of times. And the best ones I never actually get through. So by all means, feel free to jump in. So like I said, I want to ask you to start by doing something. And I have here a set of materials that one might find at the outset of a digital humanities project. So I want you to imagine yourself as researchers, as scholars from your own background. And I say to you, you have a corpus, 1,500 novels, full text, plain text, rich XML, but you have the whole novels, written between 1780 and 2000, so a wide swath of time, many novels, not everything. You have metadata for these novels. They're tagged for authors, they're tagged for author gender, and they're tagged for date of publication, but pretend that's all you have. And since it's a thought experiment, let's pretend you have access to everything you need, all the time, all the money, all the programming resources. You can do anything you want with these materials. I want you to think about these two questions. First of all, given access to these resources, what can be asked of this corpus that would interest a digital humanities researcher? So, I've given you these. Give me a project. Give me a research question that you could answer, or at least think about answering with these resources. What would you do?
Pronoun uses by author gender.
Ooh, pronoun uses by author gender. I like that. I like that a lot. We're thinking along the same lines.
Use of place names and changes with colonial powers, and so working a lot in the Caribbean and different areas. Like, is it the Gap known as the more popular Gap, or is the Gap in a particular novel something that's going to be different in a particular subset area of Barbados?
Oh, that's good. I like the geolocative aspect of that, because that's really important. And it combines the kind of quantitative literary digital humanities that we've done in the literary lab with the kind of spatial humanities that I think is like a growth industry, if you excuse the term. Other thoughts?
Time series analysis of language structure.
Love it. Time series analysis, so how language changes over time, because we know it changes radically. And in a literary context, it's interesting to see how that changes against the backdrop of language in itself. This is what we do, right? This is what we do as digital humanists. We see this, and I come, as you'll see, from a very specific disciplinary background. I have training in English, I have training in computer science, so when I think through DH projects, I think through them in terms of literary studies and computational or quantitative analysis. So these are all ideas that I love and plan to steal. This was part of my purpose in being here today and asking you this. But as I said, that is challenge number one. And it's one that we're accustomed to, and it's one that we come natively to, as it were. The real challenge is to reformulate those questions and ask yourself not what would you do with those materials as a digital humanist, as a literary scholar, as a historian, as a classicist, or even as a social scientist. Imagine now you're a computer scientist. What do you do with those materials as a computer scientist? Exactly. And create an algorithm or test an algorithm that you currently have, say an NLP package, in order to see how it operates in a literary context on language that isn't precisely like natural language, but like specifically coded language, for example. Absolutely.
Try and map descriptions of plants and descriptions of fauna to photos of them, because you could refine some of the image training algorithms with descriptions over time of the different plants, which you often have in colonial literature is extremely descriptive of trees, plants, flowers, and where they
That's an excellent example because I mean that gets at a hard problem in CS, right? The linkage between the image and the description of the image that is so important in a lot of search and retrieval algorithms, and a great project overall because as you can see from the way I'm asking these questions, what I'm really trying to get at is the fact that same materials, same group of people, radically different questions, and not just radically different questions in terms of one person is interested in history, one person is interested in literature, radically different questions in terms of what counts as knowledge production in these different disciplines. As I said at the outset, one of the things that makes the field of digital humanities so, I think, unique within the academy is its very transdisciplinary nature. Here I've given you a provisional list of all of the different fields and subjects and areas of research that my own work has touched or brushed by or been placed adjacent to. And I am not an expert in any of these fields. I know a little bit about some more than others, but from computer science to literary studies, from book history to statistics. Generally, when people sit and think through digital humanities, particularly people coming from a humanities background, they tend to think of it as a combination between computer science and a humanities discipline. In fact, my own university, Stanford, when they were trying to think through digital humanities initiatives, came up with the program CS plus X, underlining a kind of genetic connection between computer science and English, say, or history, or classics. But those of us that actually work in the field know all too well that while computer science is important, that programming is important, it actually is, if anything, one of the least important aspects in the whole universe of projects. Information science, library science, statistics. You can program all you want, you can get all the numbers that you want, but if you don't know what to do with those numbers, the project doesn't really go anywhere. To spatial humanities, questions of geography, of cultural materialism, questions of design. If it's a project that requires an online presence, that requires the creation of an accessible archive, design becomes an incredibly important and specific discipline. So the challenge of the digital humanities and the part of the paradox that I want to talk to you about today lies in the challenge of bringing these disciplines together in a meaningful way, in a way in which work can be done on a project in which the participants share a set of common goals, but which simultaneously acknowledges that the outcomes of those projects, that the outcomes of that project to each of the participants coming from these different backgrounds may look entirely different. What the individual people need out of the project, and I want to stress need, as you will see as we go forward, what the individual people need and want out of the project can be radically different depending where they are in the university and where they are in the hierarchy of the university. And so the first aspect that I want to talk to you about, the first diverging set of goals, lies in what I'm going to call transdisciplinary collaboration. So a potential solution, in fact, I'm going to argue to you later that perhaps the best solution to this paradox that I'm outlining, to the difficulty in bringing together these different knowledge areas, lies in the abilities of practitioners to collaborate across disciplines, between people on the one hand from humanities backgrounds and social scientists, scientists, and engineers. But these are rare. When I've talked to different people involved in the digital humanities, when I've talked to people setting up centers, thinking through centers, looking to start up programs, what I frequently hear is, we've got a great computer science department, we've got a great humanities department, all we need to do is get those two people talking to each other, and we're set. That's all we need. And yet, this is actually the rarest thing that I have encountered everywhere that I've been and everyone that I've talked to. Humanities practitioners working with people in computer science, people working with people in information science. There's a couple of ways in which that can happen that I'll talk to you about, but there's a lot of ways in which it doesn't happen when we expect it to. And the big question there is why? What is the barrier to participation across disciplines? And I think it has something to do with the difference between pure and applied science. And the fact that this is a distinction that is understood very, very well on one side of campus and much less well on the other side of campus. And I want to start off by acknowledging, of course, that the distinction between pure and applied science is purely convenient for me at the moment. If you examine it too closely, like any binary, it breaks down under hard observation. But here it's a useful proxy for the misunderstanding that happens so often when a humanities researcher heads across campus in order to collaborate with a, say, statistician or a computer scientist. Because humanities practitioners often confuse one for the other. They confuse pure science for applied science and vice versa, particularly in the context of computer science. This is where I've seen it most often, which is often found in the schools of engineering. And the misunderstanding, as I've outlined in the last point here, happens frequently in our understanding of a scientific field as defined by its methodologies. We look at computer science and say, well, they write programs. They are sitting there writing programs all day. That's what they do. Why can't they just write programs for us? And we'll give them data, and they will write programs, and it'll all work out. But that is the equivalent of a computer scientist or a statistician or a physicist looking across campus to, say, a French department and say, well, the point of a French department is to teach students French. I don't know what else they do. Or the point of an English scholar is to teach students grammar, and I'm not sure what else they do. So even in the humanities, we have a kind of pure and applied divide. We just don't think of ourselves along those axes quite as easily as we assume from the humanities side of campus that I think the scientific disciplines that we think of the scientific disciplines as doing. And it goes wrong, I think, in one of two ways. If I'm going to put a positive spin on it, I would suggest that we have an assumption that the questions that we have are just really interesting questions. I really want to know something about gender representation in early 19th century literature. Who wouldn't want to know something about gender representation in an early 19th century literature? And so I take that question and I just assume that people are going to be interested in it. The negative side of that assumption, of course, is the underlying unspoken assumption that if we go across campus to computer science, a methodological field as we understand it, that really what you have over there is a method in search of an object. And isn't it great that we're just like puzzle pieces fitting together? I've got a question and they've got a method, and we'll just come together and they can apply their method to my question, and that's it. But the reason this breaks down, the reason that never, ever works, is that there's a fundamental difference in knowledge creation between different disciplines. And we already see this between history and between literary studies. We see this between classics and, say, for example, book history. And we see it at a much larger scale between, I think, different larger disciplines or disciplinary areas, between science and the humanities, between social science and information science. And this is not a perfect distinction, and this doesn't capture all of the activities of humanities, and it certainly doesn't capture all of the activities of sciences, but this is, I think, one of the crucial axes along which this misunderstanding happens. And that is, we understand what we do as inherently speculative reasoning on historical or critical questions, that there's a heavily interpretive aspect. And you can see this in the journal articles. Actually, one of the students I have really wants to do a project on this, which I'm a little leery of, but she wants to go through journal articles in the humanities and see how many times in an article the author claims to be making a fundamental, life-altering change to the field, right? That is the level of rhetoric on which we operate. If I discover a new Trollope novel, it'll revolutionize Trollope novel studies forever. Versus knowledge in the sciences, which can be like that, but it can also be procedural, minute, and formalized. Optimizing an algorithm within the context of computer science is a research outcome, and it's a research outcome that has itself as a knowledge object. And this is something that we fail to understand. So when we head across campus with our questions, we fail not only to understand why those questions aren't natively interesting to computer scientists, but that computer scientists or statisticians or whoever it is we're seeking to collaborate have their own questions about the data that they might want to be able to figure out. And being able to come to an understanding on what each person or each group can get out of that is crucial in thinking through collaboration. Now, The other side of this equation, and I'm sorry for the longer preamble before I get to the more interesting case study, I think, but I wanted to lay out a couple of ground rules here. The other side of, I think, one of the diverging set of expectations that happen so often in the digital humanities has to do with the academic hierarchy in which we are all caught. This, of course, I'm resolving this to a kind of academic ranking, and that's a little oversimplified, so I apologize for that. But it works very well to think through this as a difference in need and a difference in time. From undergraduates to faculty, to junior faculty, to senior faculty, graduate students, and academic staff all operate on vastly different timescales. Undergraduates attend a school for 4 years, and they think through the experience at the level of courses, typically, whether that's quarters or whether that's terms. That's the horizon of their expectations. Graduate students are there for 5 to 7 years, and the unit of their experience, I think, very strongly, is the dissertation block, right? It is that 2 to 3 period that they're worried about when they come in and panicking about when they leave, that is their dissertation. Junior faculty, as I am learning all too well, live in a kind of 5 to 7 year purgatory on the tenure clock. And the unit of experience there is the pre-tenure period itself, as I know, because all of my colleagues talk about when tenure happens. Then life can truly begin. Senior faculty, of course, have no set windows. Not that their life is all sunshine and roses, but really. And the unit of their experience really is defined by their current interests. This is the phase in which they are interested in X versus the phase they're interested in Y. Staff are much more complicated, because at the same time as they have a longer horizon of expectations in terms of employment, one hopes, as long as they're permanent staff and not temporary staff, which is a whole other distinction that I don't have time to get into. At the same time, they have much less of an ability often to set their own workflow, to set their own time to completion of various tasks and projects that they undertake, as compared to faculty within the university. And this is something that often goes unacknowledged, because of course one of the things that I really want to hit home here is that academic staff also have research interests and necessary outcomes too, that even more frequently than the computer science or science humanities divide go unacknowledged as well. And then, of course, there's needs, right? Undergraduates need to graduate, number one, but they need to graduate with a set of skills that will prepare them for a profession that they've chosen. Graduate students also need to graduate, which I'm not sure all of them are convinced of, but they also require material for their portfolio, whether or not they go into an academic job or the academic job market and need a certain set of materials that they can show a search committee, or they want to move into a different career altogether. They still need to come up with some kind of object that will justify the time in graduate school. We, junior faculty, need material outputs that contribute towards tenure decisions, because that's all there is at the moment. As senior faculty, I think very strongly seek to advance knowledge in their field, and their set of needs have more to do with reputation, both for the program they find themselves embedded in and for themselves, but also simply a desire to know. And of course, staff are required to balance their intellectual needs with the specific demands of their job. So need, again, divides all of the different ways in which these groups come together to work on a project. And to sort of concretize this, I want to actually give you a case study of a particular project that I have been involved in for a couple years at the Literary Lab, called The Performance of Character. Coincidentally, which starts exactly with the same set of materials that I got you guys to start with. So I saw what you would do with it, now you learn what I wanted to do with it. But before I get quite to that project, just because I assume most of you aren't familiar with the organization at Stanford, the Literary Lab is primarily a research institution embedded within the English department, but adjacent to a number of other digital humanities research organizations in campus. So it travels among a number of different disciplines. It has members from across campus. And its overall goal is literary, historical, and critical research using computational methods, using text mining to better address questions of literary, critical, or historical concern. And Alan, I love the fact that this is how you referred to it because, of course, I'm a digital humanist, so if I want to describe the makeup of the lab, I'm going to do it with a network. This is the current makeup of the literary lab. From a certain point of view, I've made a network in order to visualize it. Each one of the nodes is one of our participants, and they're connected to each other by whether or not they're working on a project together. And as you can see from an immediate glance at the network, one of the first conclusions is I'm involved way too much. And so this has caused some deep reflection on my part. I've colored this in terms of role. And it's not perfect because it's not a binary, but I've colored faculty either at Stanford or elsewhere in green. Purple are graduate students. Orange are staff. Blue are research assistants. And then there are two odd colors, Glenn, which is that little spike, I'll talk about Glenn a bit more later, who's pink, who works at the library, and Shosho, who's the dark green, who is our high school intern, 15 years old and terrifyingly intelligent. And so you can see the universe of the lab. We have about 30 participants. They come from all of these different walks of campus, different academic positions and different academic places. Many are in English, a lot are not. Some are in history, some are in linguistics, some are in computer science, some are in psychology. And we come together and work in various groups and clusters in order to advance projects that we are all interested in. And this is why the question of divergent expectations is so urgent to me, because we deal with it on a daily basis. When we get together and say we should do this, we don't stop to think about the roles of each of the people going into it, and more importantly, what the this is that we do. As a lab, we have a very set series of outputs. We publish a pamphlet series. We have 13 out now. And they both look like and unlike traditional academic output, which is to say that we have 13 roughly article length, some shorter, some longer. They tend to be more image heavy. We have a very distinctive narrative style when we publish them. So they're not quite an academic article, but they occupy that space within, I think, the deliverable outputs of academic research. At the same time, we also have a blog called Techne, which, very much in keeping with the theme of this conference, seeks to acknowledge the kind of invisible labor that goes into the projects that we do. And by that, we mean both people who don't traditionally get named on the pamphlets, although we try and name everybody who works on it, sometimes it's impossible, have an outlet there to talk about what they did and how they worked. But also, and more centrally, it also makes visible the kind of mechanical, algorithmic, programming labor that goes into all of the projects, since our pamphlets focus primarily on the literary, historical, and critical questions that we seek to answer. So this is the Literary Lab, and this is the project that we sought to answer with those materials. The performance of character. Really, the question that motivated this is, what if we think about gender not as something essential to an author of a text, but instead as a performance by an author of a text in the dialogue of the characters that he or she writes. In other words, to put it slightly more straightforwardly, what is the difference between how a male author writes a female character and how a female author writes a female character, and vice versa for male characters? So rather than essentializing the discourse of masculinity or femininity, as so many DH projects formally have done, can we nuance this by looking in a very Butlerian way at gender as a dialogic performance within the text? So you can see that there are three really key parts of this project. Studying the dialogic speech in novels as gendered performances by the author. And in this sentence, I think we capture three of the different strands, three of the different divergent strands that came together to make up this project. Studying the dialogic speech assumes that we can extract dialogic speech from novels, which is a much trickier task than it seems on the surface. In novels presumes that we're studying a historical corpus of literature, and as gender performance by the author suggests a kind of literary theoretical approach that we want to take. So, three kind of subject areas for the project, three different people primarily collaborating on it. Dan Jarafsky, Chair of Linguistics, Professor of Linguistics, me, and Grace Musney, a PhD student in computer science working specifically in NLP. We are the three acknowledged collaborators on this project. And we have three different sets of intellectual goals going into it. Dan is particularly interested in natural language processing and behavior and language systems. He is interested in coding for different kinds of feature extraction. I'm particularly interested in literary criticism and history. I'm interested in gender, specifically gender as a performative act, and how social codes are expressed in literature. Grace is, as I said, an NLP student. She is much more purely, straightforwardly computer science than either Dan or I, although with a strong linguistics focus. She is interested in developing new NLP tools that can be accessioned into Stanford's suite of core NLP tools. She's interested in questions of how language changes over time and how that can be accessed computationally. But during the course of this project, she also became very interested as gender representation as a function of what you'll see, she called a dialogism score. Now, those are our intellectual goals. Professionally, of course, we all, interestingly, occupy different places in that academic hierarchy. Dan, a full professor, wants to write articles as contributions to the field because his field of linguistics lives or dies by articles, and that is his goal. As well as they publish the core NLP tools, he's very invested in expanding the capacity of the NLP tools that are offered by his group. I'm interested in an article as a function of the tenure process. Note that the difference between the plural and the singular. Dan is interested in articles. I am interested in an article. My field lives or dies by books. I don't have time for a lot of articles. As I'm learning. And this is actually really important because during the course of this project, it turns out we had way too much to publish as a single article, so we had to start talking about how to divide our results, as you'll see, among multiple outputs. And this interacts with the needs that each of us have out of this project as a function of our professional goals. Grace, in the PhD program, also needs an article, but she needs it as part of the PhD program because it's actually a requirement. She also wants to expand core NLP tools, but, and this is an interesting point, both Dan and I are on her committee. And she had a qualifying exam about 2 months ago, near the end point of this project. So her work on this project was fully collaborative with us, but still bound up in the fact that we are both her advisors and would soon be marking her on her exams, which is an important thing to keep in mind. But when was a digital humanities project ever done by 3 people alone? We also have research assistants. And in particular, we had these 3 research assistants who worked on this project, Asha, Sarah, and Enna. And you'll note also that while there are mostly juniors and sophomores, they also have very different academic backgrounds. Asha is psychology, Sarah is in symbolic systems, particularly artificial intelligence, but she's growing more interested in digital humanities, and Enna is in a combination of English and computer science, which is a combination I understand all too well, since that was my own undergraduate academic background. So here we have hidden participants who don't get acknowledged on the website as belonging to this project because it's not all that they do, as you'll see, but who still are materially invested in particularly the outcome of this project. Our research assistants are paid by the Literary Lab through funding we receive from the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. So this is very much within the Stanford system considered as part of their training. They work 10 hours per week throughout the 3 quarters of the year, fall, winter, and spring. And then during the summer, we actually up their hours because they aren't officially in classes to a full 40 hours per week for the whole summer term, turning them from research assistants in the traditional sense into really effectively full-time employees that work on our projects most of the time, which interestingly is why most of the digital humanities work happens in the summer for outputs that come out throughout the year. We try to front-load the summer in order to do a lot of the background work that enables the research to happen throughout the rest of the year, and it's the undergraduate research assistants that really do a lot of that front-loading. But as we've looked around the research assistants, as we've talked to the research assistants that we've had and done different hiring initiatives, both within the literary lab and within the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, which is the umbrella lab that houses us, it turns out that, and this I'm going to acknowledge is maybe somewhat unique to Stanford. They don't care so much about getting paid. That's not really why they're doing it. Really, more than anything, they value the intellectual work and the intellectual participation that they get out of the project. And this is what's really, really important to them. Now, for this project, we can sort of outline their goals as such. Follow the direction of the literary lab staff as per their employment. I mean, they have a set of responsibilities. They have hours they have to fill, and we fill their hours with work that we give them. But at the same time, as I said, this is part of their education. And what's great about what I think is great about what we can do with them is we give them a chance to participate in actual ongoing research. We give them the chance as undergraduates to actually draw conclusions, to participate in the process of discovery. And at the same time, hopefully give them skills that are applicable to whatever their future degrees are. But this project is slightly different because all three of the people that got involved in it, all three of the undergraduate research assistants that got involved in it, also had a very different goal, and that is activism. In this specific project, which sought to complicate gender roles and gender representation, all three expressed specific interest in the research goals as activist outcomes for the project. All three suggested that they would actually be interested in using the results to somehow enact change in current social codes and authorial practice, both through pedagogical and critical practices. We haven't figured out exactly how to do that. We've always understood our research is mostly reflective, but this is an important example of divergent goals. They want to use the conclusion to somehow change the things they're finding, whereas we are traditionally used to thinking of, oh, well, we found this thing, that's interesting, let's write about it. And by writing about it somehow, we do that kind of change work. But that's not always true. And I think the activist impulse of the research assistants is really important to acknowledge here. But that's yet again not all. So we have our three primary participants, our three research assistants. But what about the library? We got to get the corpus from somewhere. And that somewhere turns out to have a name, and that name is Glenn Worthy, who is the Digital Humanities Librarian at Stanford and the co-director for the Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Research, who has his own set of research and professional goals. Glenn is a trained Russian scholar. He's really interested in Russian formalism, and so actually materially, intellectually interested in the kinds of research that we do at the lab and participates fully as a member. But at the same time, he's also, as someone who has worked in the libraries for a number of years, also interested in questions of sampling, questions of archival resources, and particularly in corpus creation. As a professional, on the other hand, working in the library, he also has a mandate to expand the capacity of the digital resources held by Stanford. And as a member of the library, he's there also as part of his job to support research and teaching inside and outside of the library system. So for Glenn, the work that we're doing is interesting at the level of corpus already. So us receiving the corpus and figuring out what to do with it is one thing, but for Glenn's participation, he was already interested in simply assembling the corpus as a form of academic argument. Again, divergent research goal. Okay. So what did each one of us do for the project? Well, what's interesting is that there seems to be an inverse correlation between the amount of work each one of us did and our position on the academic hierarchy. Grace designed the quotation extraction algorithm, tested it against a number of gold standards, and also designed an algorithm for attributing quotations to genders, resolving co-references and figuring out for each line of speech that we extracted, was it said by a male or a female. I helped put together the corpus of novels, led the effort in adding metadata to the text. I did a lot of computational analysis based on the corpus of quotations that Grace extracted, although she did equally, if not more, than I did in that vein as well. And then, of course, my role, which was actually odd, since I tend to focus in a lot of the projects I work on the computational side, my primary role in this project was interpreting the historical results that we found by doing the analysis of our quotation corpus. Dan supported Grace's work in quotation extraction, contributed to the coding, provided a lot of the resources for parsing the corpus, and discussed interpretations on a regular basis in our weekly meetings. Research assistants were responsible for taking the corpus with author and gender metadata, and then once we had started modeling quotation extraction, once we extracted quotes and attributed them, they did a lot of work in terms of going through and assessing how our quotation extractor and how our gender attribution model were performing. So they were really responsible for giving us the data to understand how to iterate and improve the model that we created. They also participated in our weekly meetings to discuss the results of the project. The Digital Humanities librarian, as I said, provided the OCR text for our 18th to 19th century novel corpora, assisted in the legal acquisition and the use of our 20th century materials. Post-copyright texts are tricky, and with Glenn's help, we think we've navigated it appropriately. But he was absolutely material in enabling us to be able to do that. And also, equally as important, and something I haven't even touched on, established data storage and legacy protocols for both the results and our marked up corpus after the project had finished. Before we really worked closely with the library, or outside of Stanford, I've seen this a lot as well, as I'm sure you have also. Digital humanities projects create these corpora, they do work on them, they have a result from that work, they present that result, and then everything else before goes away. And so one of the big challenges is figuring out how to accession and archive that material for future work. And this is something that the library at Stanford is very invested in. So that's what we all did. What did we find? Well, it turns out we found a number of things, and these fall along those divergent axes that I've been talking about, which is to say that this project has different things to different people. For example, in terms of our dialogue identification, we did a part of speech analysis followed by a factor analysis, and plus means this is more likely indicative of dialogue, minus means this is less likely indicative of dialogue. For Grace, this is very much, and for Dan, a really important conclusion. This is not only the basis of the model for extracting dialogue, it also provides a real concrete set of results of how speech in novels, quoted speech, differs from narration. Result number one, this is what it looks like. Result number two, using those, we actually established a score for all parts of the novel as to how dialogue-like it was. And as you can see, we can trace the dialogue likeness of dialogue, which is the top line. Obviously, dialogue is a lot more dialogue-like. And the bottom line is narration. But what's interesting is it turns out that sometimes narration looks more like dialogue than at other times. And sometimes dialogue looks more like narration than at other times. And this actually was Grace's biggest contribution so far to the project in terms of its analysis and interpretation, as she's been working to trace the history of these different changes in how dialogue-like our corpus is in both its dialogue and narration over time. Result number two. Result number three, period-specific lexical patterns. This is what I was particularly interested in. We just ran a topic model on male character speech authored by males, which is a male and female character, or male character speech authored by females, which is a female, and I could say a lot about this, but I would direct your attention to topic number 97, money, pay, paid, business, house, property, and point out that this is unique to male-authored characters. When wealth is discussed in 19th and 20th century novels, it's almost always male-authored male characters that are doing it. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions as to why that is. 3 different results, 3 different disciplinary boundaries: computer science, linguistics, literary studies. 3 divergent goals of the project. And then, of course, there's result number 4, which we all just found fascinating. This is the relative proportion of male and female speech in authors by females on the left and males on the right. You can see female authors tend to have an even proportion of male and female speech. Male authors, not so much. When male authors write dialogue, it turns out that it's males talking, almost never females. And again, we could talk about this for hours, but I'll leave you with this to ponder. But this was a conclusion that we were all excited about, and one of the places where we came together. So what did we do with these conclusions? Well, project output number 1, Dialogism in the Novel, which we've just submitted to Literary Linguistic Computing, written by the three of us together, that in the format that you can see here. Note that it doesn't touch on gender. Instead, it's specifically about the process of extracting dialogue and creating the dialogism score. Research project number 2, the performance of character. This is the literary lab pamphlet that we're working to put together based upon the literary results of the project. And if you want to talk about diverging expectations, what fascinates me is when you look at number 1 and number 2, this is the writing environment that Grace and Dan work in natively. This is, of course, a LaTeX environment with a preview on the right, but you can see the code that goes into it on the left. When we work in the humanities, this is Microsoft Word. So even the materials, even how we put together articles differs fundamentally between disciplines. And then, of course, research project number 3, our dialogue extractor is now part of Stanford's core NLP tools. And here you can see the website description of how they work. So 3 different expectations going in, so far 3 different goals coming out. And this project, I'd like to suggest, is a good example of how this collaboration can work, in that it is both collaborative and not collaborative. That is, it seems to be fulfilling the needs, the very different needs of each one of us. So, to go back to the question that I started with, how do we bring together these different disciplines? And there's been a couple of solutions that I want to end with, as well as a suggestion that have been tried by different digital humanist organizations. There's the service model. This is the Digital Humanities Center that serves to offer programming, archival, corporal services to faculty members usually, but also students who are interested in pursuing the digital humanities. And it's often talked about with a number of positives. It's frequently funded by seed grants that enable the researchers to do more than they could otherwise. It's often centralized within the library, which certainly at Stanford and I've seen other places already are grappling with issues of legacy, of data preservation, and so they can make that happen. And as I've heard many of my colleagues say, who really like this model, it allows researchers to focus primarily on the questions that interest them and preserves the individual scholarly model of research native to the humanities. To which I would say, yes, but the biggest negative point is that it preserves the individual scholarly model of research native to the humanities. It also requires a dedicated digital humanities center, both well-funded and staffed, which not a lot of universities really can afford. I think you're very lucky here to have the resources that you do, and certainly we are there at Stanford as well. It separates the researchers, particularly the humanities researchers, from the output and mechanisms of their research. Frequently what has happened with my colleagues is they'll have an idea, they'll go to a staff member and say, please go away and make this database for me, and then come back when you're done and report to me on what you've done. And that's one way to do things, but if you acknowledge that database as an object of research, then that is no longer something that is part of some of the researchers' purview. So the collaboration breaks down at that point. And of course, the service model also preserves and reifies the academic hierarchy as it creates that distinction between researchers and staff as service people, which all of us, I think, working in the digital humanities, work so hard to avoid. Solution number 2, the collaborative model, I think is really where the future lies. I think it has the potential to more fully invest in both humanities and scientific and even methodological innovations. All researchers can be part of all of the different parts of the projects. And all of the scholars involved, whether they are graduate students, whether they are academic faculty, and whether or not they are staff members, have more control over the research as a whole, and it can better answer all of their individual needs. And it demands, I think, as a consequence, less labor in terms of managed labor on the part of the staff at digital humanities centers. Having been staff at a digital humanities center in my checkered past, I feel this very keenly, because a collaborative model doesn't just bring together researchers across campus to collaborate, it also makes staff members part of the research team. But how does this happen given the divergent goals, given the lack of misunderstanding between the disciplines? And this is where I'll end. I think really what the concept I want to hammer home more than anything else is that of buy-in. It requires buy-in from all project participants to an equal extent. I'm sure you've all heard the dictum that to be a real digital humanist, you need to learn how to code. This is something Ray Steve Ramsey very famously said that's received a lot of positive and negative feedback. I don't think that's true. I don't think you need to learn to code, you don't need to learn to be a designer, and if on the other side you don't need to learn to be a literary scholar. But you need buy-in from all of these disciplines. If you don't know how to code, you need to know the principles according to which the project was coded. If you can't write the line of code, you need to know why the line of code was written in the way that it does. You need to know how it was coded, what decisions went into creating it, and why those decisions were made. And knowing those three, you can better extract the research goals that you need and all your collaborators need from the project. It's more demanding for the researchers involved. It requires reaching across fields, thinking outside of the ways of the disciplinary training that we've all received as members of our respective fields, but I think it's only in this buy-in model, it's only in looking at what other people do, acknowledging their needs, acknowledging their different expectations, and understanding, most importantly, what counts as a knowledge object for different people in different fields, and acknowledging that there is a difference there. And I think it's only in all of that that we can really achieve the transdisciplinary potential in the digital humanities. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. We have a couple minutes for questions before we break out into our groups. So, since no one interrupted. Yeah, there we go.
How do you change, well, maybe not change, but guide the perspective of the researcher in coming to the table with this kind of model for buy-in, rather than being like, assuming that computer science just wants to do their work, or that inherently they're going to be the lead and then everybody else is going to be subservient to that?
The word no has been exceptionally powerful. And I say that as someone who finds it really difficult. Let me remind you. I say that as someone who finds it really difficult to say no. But we have a rule at the Literary Lab, and it's actually a rule that's been replicated across a lot of the labs at Stanford, which is, if someone comes to us and say, hey, I've got this thing I'm doing, can you do this? No, absolutely not. If you want to come collaborate with us, we will absolutely do that. We have resources we can draw on, but you need to make the project interesting to us as an organization and to the individual members that you expect to be collaborating on this project. And I think no is a really powerful word, and it's hard to say, and it's particularly hard for academic staff to say. So it has to be couched very carefully in a, we can't do this, but have you thought about doing this? And I think that's what needs to happen across the board, because a lot of the attitude, I think, of senior researchers on digital humanities projects come out of a kind of intimidation. I don't know what this is, therefore I don't want to deal with it. So for me personally, when I've sat down and talked to senior faculty, you say, well, Mark, you go ahead and code this and then show me the results of it. I will say, okay, so you want a topic model. Do you want a Gibbs or a VEM? And if we do a Gibbs, how do you want the burn-in set? Because you really get different ranges of topical consistency when you do that. Oh, and how many topics do you want? Do you want like a high alpha or a low alpha? And somewhere in that explanation, they'll stop me and say, what? And I'll say, well, all of these parameters will vastly change what it is that we get out of it. And by engaging them, I think, in that conversation, they begin to see that it's not a matter of just going off and doing it and coming back with the results, but that every project, whether it's like a topic model, whether it's a design model, whether it's an archive, they all require so many different choices at every stage that I think it really hammers home the fact that this is also a part of the research. It's not simply a way to display the research. It's not an augmentation of the research. It vastly affects what research can be done. So those two things, I think, both saying no to service models and arguing for collaboration. And also in that process, making clear all of the choices that have to go in and why you'd want to be careful about those. That, I think, can start to change attitudes. It's not perfect, but it's a start.
Yeah, so I was curious, the way you were talking about having weekly research meetings with your entire group, and if you could talk a little bit about sort of what seems to work well in that weekly setting, and what were maybe some of the pitfalls you've come across.
Yeah, well, as you can see from this graph, we have 20 different projects going on. And all of the different projects are at different stages, and so they demand a different kind of attention, right? So when I said we had weekly meetings, that group, Grace, Dan, and I, and the 3 research assistants, mostly the 3 research assistants, they had class schedules that we had to sort of work around. So sometimes all 3, sometimes 1 or 2. But Grace, Dan, and I met every week during the intensive phase of this project. And that generally is what happens when a project is sort of in that very investigatory phase. At the beginning, when we were assembling the corpus, we didn't meet weekly. It was sort of this is what we need, let's go off and figure out how to get it together. Now, we certainly aren't meeting weekly. We're sort of firing articles back and forth. But in that sort of intensive phase, and recognizing what phase a project's in is also really, really important, and being able to schedule for that. So we probably have 5 or 6 of those, actually probably 8 of those projects that are in that intensive phase right now, whereas the rest are in other stages of development, either being written up or still in the initial sort of investigatory stages. And we've tried to keep, so one of the things I've done with the lab since assuming the directorship last year is try and make it slightly more modular, right? So that we have 4 to 5 quarterly meetings of the entire lab, and at those, the individual groups will say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're hoping to do, what do you think? And get feedback. And then on a weekly basis, those individual groups will get together and talk about the very intensive things that they're working on. And that balance between very local work and a kind of global understanding of what the lab is and what it does, I think has been helpful in whatever success that we've had. Yeah, Therese.
Two quick things. Thank you so much for this presentation. One is I'm hoping in some of the breakout sessions we might even complicate the term of service, because it occurs to me that's a very contentious term. In the university, it's a part of every academic's career, but there are good ideas of service, there are bad ideas of service. There are definitely ways to complicate the notion of service, and I hope we do that so that we can set up as many complex narratives as possible. The other thing that is striking me is I come from a very interdisciplinary field already, and it occurs to me the grant funding agencies we have to justify our work for, it seems like they want us to position ourselves in a medieval sense as belonging to a simpler discipline than we do, to make clear the need, why we need to reach out to someone for help. Mm-hmm. Have you run into that? I mean, is that just my perception or has that been the case for the projects you've worked on, where to a certain extent, to justify the need for you all to come together, you literally had to try to convince the NEH that you had less resources on your own than you really did, because you needed to go to this corpus linguist, or vice versa?
Well, fortunately, that is not something I've personally... Wow. I haven't personally run into yet. Partly because, digital humanities is enough of a growth area.
Maybe mute the computer, I don't know.
Let's try that. Maybe it's enough of a growth area that it's not... It wasn't the computer. That it's not as important. Or it's enough of a growth area that that's what the NEH is interested in funding. So once you say digital, then you sort of get there anyway. I see what you're saying, but and there is a kind of lip service to the fact that we all come together with different expertise. I don't know if I don't think we've had to pretend we had less expertise than we did. One of the ways in which I think this has happened is that we've had to reach out to different institutions and different universities that have different resources. So it frequently comes down to a question of resources. We need to get together these corpora. We need to get together these things. And that certainly happened. We hired David as our technical director last year, David McClure, who's a brilliant programmer.
I was once a computer scientist.
That is applied science. And I mean, we had to make that argument to have him come into the lab in terms of creating infrastructure. So again, I think that argument for us has mostly resolved not to expertise, but to resources. And I think the more that we can do that, in fact, the more the NEH and the Mellon and other granting groups, especially if part of that resource is public outreach, the more they tend to, I think through the positives of what we're doing.
I'm not sure if the technology was telling us it was time or something. Like it's
Yeah.
stomach was growling. But we'll have plenty more time to talk, and I hope people will be able to ask you questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I'm not going
thank
anywhere.
you again, Mark Algee-Hewitt. Let's zoom through your talk really fast here. Okay. So I'm just going to speak for 2 minutes about what we're going to do, and heading off into the workshop. So one is a practical matter, and then one just sort of bit of framing. The practical matter is fairly simple. As Paul mentioned, you have a sticker on your
Appreciate it. Thank you.
name tag there, and these correspond to the various breakout rooms, which you can see right